Hello, my name is Sohela Nazneen. I'm a fellow based at the Institute of Development Studies at University of Sussex in the UK. Today I will be talking about women as agents of change in Bangladesh. My lecture is divided into 4 parts, and each part is signaled in the PowerPoint as separate parts. And at the end of the lecture, you will be able to see the different sources I used to get information for this lecture. So women as agents of change, before I start, I need to explain why I named this. Partly in this lecture, we will look at the trends in development and changes in women's status. In Bangladesh, that has happened quite rapidly. So looking at these trends, we need to look at, and changes, we need to look at how did these changes happen, and look at the role of the state and also different development agencies, whether they're NGOs like Brac or whether they're different international NGOs, for example, like ActionAid, or whether they are state agencies, for example, Bangladesh government, the different programs that Bangladesh government had and what role that played. Apart from that, the different actors that played a role, women themselves did quite a lot. So we will take an historical overview of that, looking at different key figures in Bangladesh's history who worked on women's rights or on women's education or social welfare issues. After that, we will look at what did women in general, ordinary women, play apart from the historical figures that we talk about. Then we will look at the role of women's movement in terms of the collective struggles around women's rights that took place in Bangladesh and how different policies and laws changed because of that. And then lastly, we will look at the challenges that we are facing now in terms of the gains made in women's rights and gender equality. So let's begin. So basically, in terms of, I explained what the structure of the presentation is and what we are going to look at, but why look at women as agents of change? So when we talk about women in Bangladesh, a lot of the time we use stereotypical images of women. For example, in development literature, a lot of the time we talk about poor women, we talk about how women in Bangladesh are deprived of their rights, or we have typical ideas about what they do. For example, women as microcredit borrowers or women targeted for specific social protection schemes. So for example, the widow schemes or the vulnerable group development schemes that you hear about in sort of village development, or we talk about the garment workers. A lot of the time we talk about history and we talk about the role of women in 1971, or women as cultural markers of Bangladeshi culture and Bengali language and culture. So you talk about saris, you talk about women as freedom fighters, or you talk about women experiencing specific suffering during 1971. So we talk about the Biranganas. So they are talked about in a specific manner. But the point of this lecture is to nuance that understanding and look at the different types of roles and images of Bangladeshi women. So partly, in a way, we are trying to look at what changes happened, because changes happened in a dramatic way. And partly also we are trying to look at what is the her story. So when we think about Bangladeshi history and social changes, what is the story behind that and what is the role of women? So basically, as I said, I will start with a change, looking at a change in the trends of women's role and status, both at the social level, but also in politics and economics, and also sort of in their legal status. So let's have a look at where women are situated now and what kind of changes have taken place. So this gives you a little gist of different arenas, as I said. Obviously, the picture is much more complex, but I've chosen specific types of statistics to show the jump. So as I have already argued, women's condition and status has changed. Bangladesh, you know that UNDP ranks different countries according to their human development. There is also an index which looks at gender and development, basically looking at women's status in health, education, and also economic participation. And you can see Bangladesh in 2018 ranked as the 134th country, and we have about 197 countries in the world. But it's not just about the ranking, it's about the pace of change. So in 1971, when Bangladesh became independent, in terms of health and education, life expectancy of women, where Bangladesh was, if you look at it now, the growth or the advancement has been at a faster rate compared to India or Pakistan or Nepal, basically all the countries in South Asian region. So I have some statistics here in terms of health. So in terms of maternal mortality, this dropped to more, it was more than halved. So if you look at in 1986, what the rate there is, and in 2001, what the rate is, that's the statistics I have there, that's, you have the rate in terms of mortality rates, so in terms of women dying, giving at childbirth. So that has improved steadily later down the years after 2001. In terms of fertility rates, that is basically how many children women have. In 1970s, the average rate or birth rate of fertility rate of the number of children women had was 7.4. In the last decade, that became 2.7. Now it is 2.3. So that has halved. That has more than halved, as you can see. In terms of education, the literacy rate for in the adult population, it's about 50% for women. But in terms of girls' education, if you look at enrollment in primary school and secondary school, we have reached gender parity. So what that means is you have 50% girls and 50% boys. And that's partly because of the stipend program that you hear about, the female secondary education stipend program, that the rates went up. So that was an initiative by the Bangladesh government. Let's look at Bangladesh context in terms of, and status of women in terms of legally, how they're positioned. Legally, the constitution guarantees equal rights, but equal rights that's in public sphere. So in terms of the economy, politics, obviously you have equal rights. And as citizens, you have equal rights. But you do not have equal rights in the private sphere. That is basically our marriage, divorce, inheritance, custody of children. All of these are governed by religious personal laws, or known as family law. So that means that Muslim women are governed by the Sharia when it comes to marriage or divorce or inheritance. Hindu women are governed by the Daya Bhaga code. Christian women are governed by which denomination they belong to. So it depends on your religion how that would be affected. Which also means that basically you don't have equal rights in terms of, let's say, divorce if you're a Muslim woman compared to men. But also you are not, Hindu women in Bangladesh cannot divorce. So you have differences between which religion you belong to if you're a woman in terms of what kind of rights you have. We all know that violence against women is a problem in Bangladesh. I have an older statistics here which says that 49% of ever married women, that is women who were ever married, experienced some form of physical violence in Bangladesh. And basically the rates haven't really changed that significantly. And that is a problem that we need to tackle. So I talked about, this is about domestic violence, but violence also happens in public spaces, and we will talk about that later on in this lecture. Child marriage, which is basically if you're under 18 and being married, is high in Bangladesh. Currently about 53% of girls are married underaged, which is a key issue, because if you're underage and you haven't finished your education and your body is not ready for conjugal relationship, those have health impacts and also impact on your growth. So that is an issue that needs tackling. So apart from legal status and also looking at violence against women, there are other changes have happened also in other arenas of our lives. So for example, in politics, women's participation has increased. In parliament, you know that there are 50 reserved seats. About 20% of the parliamentarians are women. Partly they come in through the reserved seats. In local government, if there is a 25% reservation for women, that means that 3 seats in a ward are reserved for women apart from the 10 general seats. We have had a women prime minister since 1991. We have had women speakers, we have had women ministers. If you compare Bangladesh to a lot of other countries, obviously this kind of participation is an achievement. Of course, you can raise questions about what women have done once they have occupied positions of power. Are they effective or not? That is a different debate. But at least we have, or we see women in political lives. Let's look at labor force participation or work. The participation rate is about 33%. Obviously, there are different occupations that are female dominated. In urban areas, you do see garment workers. You also see women in informal sectors, for example, domestic work, government sector work or public sector work has quotas, about 15%, which is currently being withdrawn as much as I guess. But because of the quota system, partly, you have a lot of women teachers in primary education, you have women in health, you have women in nursing, and these are also named as female sectors because generally we think of women as teachers or nurses and it's easier for women to work in these sectors. But there are other sectors that are where women are not as prominent. In terms of the wage gap or what you're paid, that is narrowing in the professional jobs, but there is still wage gap. In the rural areas, you mainly see women working in agriculture, particularly processing food or crops at home, raising poultry, doing other kinds of work. Women also work on public work schemes. So for example, particularly poor women in terms of road construction, business, construction work that are commissioned by the government. You also have women as microcredit borrowers to start home-based businesses and small schemes. And you all know about the different credit providing NGOs. That is one of the key schemes, development schemes that was experimented and started in Bangladesh, and which has been quite successful. So basically, that's a snapshot of a picture of how women are present in different arenas of life. So there's a question about how did this change happen? So if you look back in 1973, when the government of Bangladesh was developing the first 5-year plan, women were mainly mentioned as mothers, and also there was rehabilitation for rape survivors of war, the Biranganas, and also women were mentioned in education. But women were not mentioned for other sectors for which Bangladesh government was developing a plan. But if you look at development plans now, women are mentioned quite a lot. They are mentioned in planning in terms of targets of specific policies because they use certain services. They are sort of targeted for economic development. They are mentioned as leaders of civil society organizations. They're involved as policymakers. So you see this change, and you see sort of how development planning has changed. And behind this change, obviously, there were many different types of actors. Bangladesh government played a key role in sort of following through with progressive policies, and this is successive government. I'm not talking about this party or that party. It's all parties who came to power actually pursued this. So you see family planning programs starting in the 70s and being followed through. You see healthcare programs, vaccination programs, raising awareness about maternal mortality services. You see education programs, for example, the girls, in our girls' education, I mentioned the female stipend, secondary stipend program. Successive governments continued these successful programs and policies and made legal changes that helped to facilitate women's empowerment and change in women's status. In terms of NGOs, obviously NGOs did service delivery, so service delivery in health or non-formal education or credit or legal aid, and it sort of raised awareness. It engaged with rural women extensively. So NGOs, if you mention Grameen Bank or Brac or Proshika or Asha, there are many different types of NGOs that engage with women extensively. The donors played a critical role here. I know we are used to critiquing donors, whether that is USAID or the Swedish SIDA. We talk about different donors and we critique them, but donor funding in 80s, 90s did facilitate different kinds of policy changes, different kinds of programming. For example, in terms of raising awareness about human rights, developing programs that would address violence against women, shelters for battered women, anti-trafficking activities. These were funded. These were started off as donor-funded projects, and they have been successful. So we talk about different actors, but of course the key role played in all of this, whether government initiatives or NGO programs or donor-funded projects, are the women themselves for whom the programs were being implemented. So let's look at the role of women. So this is the next segment of the lecture, the role of women. Women as agents of change, or women working to change their own fate, has a long tradition in Bangladesh. Bangladesh's women have a long history in terms of participating in anti-colonial struggles against the British, and then in sort of in the nationalist movement, sort of the independence movement for Bangladesh. They also have a history in terms of participating in various social welfare activities, flood relief activities for poor women, and also in terms of economic entrepreneurship. So some of you know about the historical figures I will mention. So Rokeya, you're very familiar with Begum Ruqya Sakhawat Hussain, who worked on girls' education and education for Muslim women in British India. She also wrote many seminal pieces, and those are known as women's rights and feminist pieces. So I'll show you a picture of her. That is her, Begum Ruqya. This is one of her key works, Sultana's Dream, which talks about a state that is run by women, that is based on science, environmentally friendly, that has sort of freedom and independence, the kind of autonomy that you want for women. Some of you may know about Pritilota Waddedar, who fought the British and attacked the European club in Chittagong, led that attack. So this is a picture of Pritilota. Some of you are familiar with Ila Mitro, who was a leader in the Tebaga movement, which was about peasants' rights. Some of you may know about Kumudini Hajang, who was from an indigenous group, led anti-British struggle. Apart from the struggles, there were prominent social welfare workers. So for example, Leela Nag or Samsul Nahar Mahmood, who worked extensively for social welfare and disaster relief and also for women's education. All of you will know about Sufia Kamal, who is a poet, but who also is the founder, leader of Bangladesh Mohila Parishad, the premier organization on women's rights, one of the largest women's organizations in Bangladesh. So we have a rich history of women leaders. But we also have a rich history of just ordinary women working to improve their fate. So in terms of when I say women's agency, what I mean by agency is what women are able to do and how they're able to act. So I've already talked about women credit borrowers of different NGO programs. You have to think about when these programs started. A lot of the women in Bangladesh do not inherit any property, neither do they handle a lot of cash. So targeting women was an innovative idea, and women being able to use the money to improve their lot, to do poultry business or to raise goats or whatever that you're doing, and to be able to spend money on family welfare and decide how the money is going to be spent is a big shift. For us, those of us used to money, it may seem little. At that time, for the women themselves, it wasn't. You also know that a lot of these credit programs were initially organized in groups. That meant that women had to meet outside the house, in the community, but outside in someone's house. That was an interesting break from, you're not just going for addas, you're going to meet for work. And you're meeting people, the NGO workers, who are not part of your kin group. That is a big shift in terms of your interaction. Think about 1970s, 80s, 90s, when women didn't meet a lot of men or women from outside their kin group or village or family. That shifts how you interact with the real world. It's a big change. Obviously, you can critique the credit programs in terms of repayment pressure or whether that really lifts women out of poverty. That's a different debate. But think about what the money is allowing these women to do. The second group I would like to mention are the ready-made garment workers. Basically, the job, the formal job itself for women workers allowed them to negotiate certain things, negotiate the age of marriage, when you're earning income, being able to control your income, coming out in a large group in public sphere to go to work. Think about a time in the 1980s when women were very small in numbers in terms of going to formal sector work, and suddenly you see groups of women going to work. How does that change the scenario? And we still know that women's labor is very important for that industry. Again, there can be debates about whether they're paid little money, whether they're paid a decent wage, workers' rights. We will talk about those challenges. But the fact that women going out to work shifted their agency and position. Similarly, women family healthcare workers. In 1970s, the program started. Women mostly did not have access to contraception. Now you have women coming at home, talking to you about contraception, having control over how many children you can have is a big shift. But seeing these women go from village to village to talk to different groups of women is important. Similarly, the numbers of women doctors, lawyers, academic, women serving in government positions have risen, and that has changed how you see or how you think about women's empowerment in Bangladesh. So I'll show you some pictures of a contest we ran on women's empowerment, just to give you different types of images of women instead of the poor, deprived, affected of women all the time. So let's look at those. So this is a churiwala selling something, sitting on the street, doing business. Normally, you don't think about women being on the street, but this is a normal scenario in our urban towns. This is a mechanic. As you can see, mechanic is generally a male-dominated position, but you see women also working in mechanics jobs. This is a familiar picture, women garment workers, but there was a time when this wouldn't have been familiar. Construction workers, as you can see, in informal sector work, backbreaking work, but still it's a work that is important. A women vendor in the streets, and at nighttime. We generally don't see a lot of women in nighttime, or did not used to see, and you see this. So all of these pictures have a specific symbol, and this is a woman peacekeeper. Bangladesh is known for sending troops for peacekeeping, and our women have done quite well in that. So you can see different ranges and roles played by women. So that's sort of talking about how women's status changed and what women have done, but what other actors have done. So I will shift to the next part of my lecture, which is about collective struggles. So here I will talk about the role of women's movement actors in making change happen. So basically, I work a lot or research a lot women's movement, which is about struggle for equality for women, equality in public life, equality in private life. So if you believe in that men and women are equal, you believe in women's rights. So let's look at basically the movement itself. One of my colleagues actually said that women's movement is one of the most vibrant movements, social movements in Bangladesh. It's like a small tick on the back of an elephant, which has a very loud voice. So let's look at the types of women's organization. You cannot categorize them under one category. There are many different categories. So there are activist organizations. So these are mass organizations or small-sized organizations or professional organizations. For example, Bangladesh National Women's Lawyers Association is a professional organization. Mass-based organization would be Bangladesh Mohila Parishad, which has about 300,000 members. Smaller organizations would be organizations like Nari Pokho, which has a small-sized membership. You have policy and research advocacy organizations. So these focus mainly on policy issues and analyze how policies affect women or produce research on women's rights and status. So for example, Women for Women was a policy and research advocacy organization. You also have women's NGOs or women-led NGOs like Bachte Shekha, or you have social movement-oriented NGOs, for example, like Nijera Kori, which works on social movement, not service provision or development activities. These organizations, some of them are membership-based, so you have to become a member. Some of them operate at local level, some of them are national level organizations, and how they mobilize their members vary, but they all work on women's rights. This is a picture that gives you a contrast. On the right-hand side, you can see the black and white picture is Bangladesh Mohila Parishad coming out to protest sort of Pakistan. At that time, this was Pakistan, and this is about the election results not being respected, so that 1970s election. So they're coming out, and Sufia Kamal, you can see, is leading the march. On the left-hand side is about CEDAW, which is the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women that Bangladesh is signatory to. So it is about implementing CEDAW provisions. So that's a march about that. So I'll just quickly talk about what kind of issues women's movement have worked on. So in the 1970s, the issue was about rehabilitation of the rape survivors of war, and also about getting women into various development initiatives like public works program, targeting women for credit schemes. In the 1980s, women's movement started working on violence against women. Dowry was one of the big issues that they picked up, but they also realized that a lot of the cases that are related to inheritance, divorce, marriage needed quick resolution, and there was a need to have family courts. So that became a key issue. They also focused on political participation of women, so getting reserved seats for women in different levels of government. They focused on sort of population policy and women's rights over their own bodies in terms of safe contraception. They focused on personal laws and how that affected women or women's legal status. Also, when Islam was declared as the state religion in 1988, women's movement actors, some of them protested this, partly because they felt that it created unequal status between the different citizens of Bangladesh who are of a minority religious group. So from that, in 1990s, obviously you can see the activities are expanding. Women worked against fatwa, so there were famous fatwa cases. Some of you may know about Nur Jahan's case, who was punished by the village Shalish for marrying a second time. So there was a fatwa issued against her because she did not go through the Hilla provision in the Sharia, which is banned in Bangladesh legally, but in the village she was publicly humiliated and punished, and she committed suicide. So there were quite a few fatwa cases at that time, and women's movement picked up this issue. There was an issue about sort of rape in police custody. So some of you may remember Yasmin murder case, or some of you were very young at that time, but Yasmin died because she was raped by police. And there was massive sort of mobilization against that. Women also mobilized to have uniform family code, that is equal rights for women on marriage, inheritance, divorce, custody laws for all women, even if they belong to different religion. Women also worked against acid violence, because incidents of acid attacks raised at that time. So getting provisions for acid survivors, ensuring they get health care, legal aid for acid survivors, etc. They also worked on sexual harassment against in educational institutions. Some of you may remember Jahangirnagar and university's incidents, and there was a mass mobilization against sort of sexual harassment incidents at the university, and this has continued over time. Then there is, of course, the sex workers movements, that is sex workers protesting their eviction by sort of community groups, and sort of working to ensure that they are not evicted. Anti-trafficking was a big issue at that time. In the last decade, we have looked at the issues have expanded. So the issues have focused on minority women's rights, particularly women in Chittagong Hills tracts, domestic violence, sexual harassment, sort of women who are migrating to other countries, their rights. So you can see there are many different issues that were tackled by women over the years. These are some pictures of the different movements I talk about: uniform family code, or sex workers' rights, or protest against acid attacks, or garment workers' rights. So basically you can see there have been over time lots of activism. Apart from mobilizing on specific women's rights issues, women have also been part of other social movements. So we have already talked about women's participation in the nationalist movement before 1971, during 1971, but also after 1971. Women also have been historically part of, I've already mentioned the Tebaka, or the peasant movement, but they have also been part of anti-shrimp farming movement in the Southwest, where shrimp farms destroy the land and environment. Women have been part of different land rights movements. And of course, there have been different struggles by minority women's groups and women's labor, of women being part of workers' movement and labor rights. So it's not just women only working on women's rights issues, but working also about rights of others and sort of environmental protection. So this is a nice slide that gives you a little bit of a cartoon in terms of the achievements of women's movement, but also the challenges they face. So taking cue from this slide, let's talk about the challenges to women's gains. So this is the last part of the talk. I have this picture here because it almost seems like that is what women in Bangladesh have been doing. You are trying to hold on to your gains. So let's talk about the different types of challenges. So some of the challenges are related to global level changes. Some of the challenges are related to what's happening in Bangladesh internally. One of the issues is about worker rights. So basically looking at who speaks for women, and whether these rights issues are sort of resolved in a gender just manner. So whether you're talking about the ready-made garment workers and their rights, whether you're talking about anti-shrimp farming movements, and then sort of businesses that have an environmental impact, or whether you're talking about migrant workers' rights. So it is an issue that came to the forefront, for example, for garment workers with the Rana Plaza disaster, but also in COVID-19 impact. As global economy is affected, then how do you ensure that decent wages for workers are protected, that workers have a safe workplace to work in? The second issue that's coming to the forefront in terms of maintaining women's gain is sort of the women's double burden. So women work outside, women also work at home, the cooking, the cleaning, the taking care of children, taking care of elderly, taking care of in-laws. So women have a double day. But as you engage women more and more in labor force participation, as they go out, as they work, how do you ensure that childcare happens? How do you ensure that women don't get depleted, that they are not, their energies are not completely depleted because of the burden that they carry? So that means that we need to think about how we ensure provision of care socially. How we do, you have to think about childcare creches, you have to think about elderly care, and how would you provide that? What are the alternative ways? And not just for rich women or middle class women, but what are the ways for women who cannot afford to employ another woman to do the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare? Of course, violence against women is an issue that we talked about. It's not just domestic violence, but violence in public sphere. In recent years, we have seen that going up in terms of sexual harassment, but also online harassment of women. So how do you ensure that there is a respect for women's bodily integrity or women's right to be in public space without being harassed? How do you implement the laws that exist in the criminal code or the domestic violence law that has been passed? How do you ensure that sexual harassment does not happen? How do you sort of change social norms around that? So that becomes a key issue. How do you ensure online presence of women and safety for women online? So there is that aspect. Of course, climate change is a big challenge for Bangladesh, and climate change is affecting women and men in Bangladesh. So this is in terms of your livelihoods, the kinds of work opportunities you have, but it is also in terms of how do you manage collection of water. It's also in terms of natural disasters happening more frequently and affecting your livelihoods and your home. So how do you ensure that women are able to adapt to these changes? How do you ensure that services of the states are provided? How do you ensure that climate justice, when you talk about, also ensures that that climate change impact of that is not just borne by women? Apart from these, obviously there is the issue about the biased family laws that I talked about. Some laws relate to marriage, divorce, inheritance, custody, guardianship. These are still governed by family laws that are based on customs and religion. And as we saw, women are not equal. Hindu women have specific and different rights. Muslim women have different, depending on what the religion prescribes. But in a society, you cannot have citizens that have different types of rights when it comes to marriage or divorce, that one group can divorce, the other group cannot. So it's required, a change is required, and reform has happened. Hindu laws have been reformed in our neighboring country. Muslim family laws have undergone reform in 1961. So we need to think about changing these laws so that women have an equal footing. Apart from that, obviously we need to think about norms, our conservative norms on certain issues about when we think about women's rights. How do we change these norms? And these norms, a lot of these are related to violence against women, because we see women as transgressing, as, oh, you shouldn't be out on the street, you shouldn't wear this dress, you should not be working in this space, or you should not go out in the evening. But that is because the state is not able to provide safety, or the community, people in the community behave aggressively. How do you change the norms where you just see constitutionally, if you have been guaranteed equal rights, that it is just someone's choice to be out or choice to wear what they think may be appropriate for them, and that you leave them alone? So there are different challenges, as we can see, to women's gains. And these challenges need to be addressed if you want to sustain women's presence in the economy, if you want to sustain sort of the advancement made by women in politics, or if you want to sustain advancement made by women in terms of the social development indicators. We talked about women going to school, sort of women working, women health being improved. All of these are linked to changing norms in terms of what you think people are entitled to. So I will stop here in terms of the lecture, but just to give you a gist of what I have said, I've talked about women as agents of change, and this is about her story in terms of the role women themselves played in terms of making significant gains. As we have seen in Bangladesh, we have made significant gains in social development, but we also have problems we need to tackle, and discrimination exists. We have also seen that state and development actors have played a key role, and the role that women's movement have played in taking up issues, making policy and law changes happen, focusing on issues that normally development agencies will not focus on. But despite those changes, there are new challenges related to global issues, challenges related to how we think about what women are entitled to. And we need to shift those and work hard for it. So thank you for listening to me. I hope you find the different sources that I have useful, or you look into these. So thank you very much.